I want to talk to you about how to sell vintage clothing this year. And the thing is, if you have a closet full of treasures, maybe it's an opportunity right now to start really monetizing that closet, right? So here's the opportunity I want to talk to you about. So the thing is that basically, when I speak about vintage clothing, I'm speaking about you having clothing that actually dates back to, let's say, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and maybe even the 80s. Okay, so I want you to look at that sort of chronology here. And the thing is that when you think about the vintage clothing market, you are speaking about somewhere from 300 to 400 billion dollars. Okay, so this is a market that's really exploding like crazy. I mean, folks are really looking for fashion trends and going back to the 70s and 60s. So that's really important to really think about that. One thing you have to really understand is that when you speak about vintage, you got to have a clear idea about what we're speaking about, because sometimes people speak interchangeably about vintage or antique or retro, right? There are slight differences, because when you think about vintage clothing is widely described as anything produced between 20 and 100 years ago. So if it's old, that's what it is. Okay. Now antique clothing can be anything more than 100 years ago. So you're speaking about more than a century ago. Okay. So these pieces are more rare and often bound to actually be found in museums or even personal collections. Maybe grandma or like grandpa is trying to look at his closet. Maybe so now sometimes retro clothing. Sometimes it's also called repro clothing. So any item produced today or within the past 20 years is a vintage style, and a vintage style cannot be considered vintage really. So typically, those items will be referred to as retro or repro, and repro is short for reproduction. So just wanted to really explain to you what it is. So, but today's conversation, I want to speak about vintage clothing. Okay, so vintage clothing is anything produced between 20 and 100 years ago. So I want you to really think about this time interval as you actually go through this whole conversation with me. So let me give you the step by step you need to really follow this year if you want to sell vintage clothing. First, you want to find your angle. I mean, every successful business starts in the same place, right? You got to have a small business idea. You got to have a vision. You got to have an objective in mind. So while you may just elect to pick and sell what you like, consider choosing a niche within the vintage clothing world to help your business stand apart. It's all about differentiating your business. It's all about not selling what the other person is selling, right? You want to really differentiate yourself. So you may choose to sell vintage clothing within one of the following niches: a decade or decades, say the 20s or the 1980s. Like you are the specialist of the 70s, or you only sell vintage from the 60s, for instance. So that's if you really differentiate yourself by timing. Or you can try to really have like a specific purpose or occasion, like evening wear or athletic wear. Again, within the vintage realm, you can have a high vintage designer clothing, or you can have a niche item like vintage band tees, or you can have reworked or reclaimed styles, adapting vintage clothing into new pieces, or you can have new retro clothing in a vintage style. So this is important. Or you can really do trending cycles. I mean, trending styles rather. Trending styles like 90s revival or 80s renaissance, for instance. Okay. So once you have landed on a niche, run it through a series of tests before you commit. What's your style? Is your niche too limited? Because you got to have a certain level of demand too, because you got to monetize that niche. Is it too saturated? Should you follow a trend or start a new one? What's happening on the runways, any given season? So that's number one. Number one, you want to find your angle. Number two, you want to build your vintage clothing brand. Branding is kind of quintessential when it comes to differentiating yourself. So building a solid brand for your vintage business will help you find a relevant audience, create a guide for future hires as you expand, and keep your focus consistent. So what you want to do is you want to define your vintage clothing brand at this early stage, because later on you wouldn't have time, and because you want to really constitute a strong foundation right now. Okay, And so you want to reference your brand guidelines later on as you design your site and curate your collections. Very important. Next, you want to really fund your business idea. It's all about money. I mean, you can have a great vintage branding, but if you have no resources, if you have no cash behind it, that's just it's just dead. Okay, so you got to have cash for inventory. You got to buy inventory upfront, unless you opt for a consignment model, paying for the items after they are sold. You can also bootstrap and sell vintage clothing piece by piece on an online marketplace such as Amazon or eBay or Etsy, using sales to buy more inventory. The thing is, as you scale, consider how long your living space will be able to handle your storage needs and plan ahead when you may need to upgrade to a dedicated office or warehouse space. Or you can even go with a drop shipping model where you basically are outsourcing the warehousing to a third party, or you can just negotiate with a 2PL or 3PL provider, third party logistics provider, to actually take care of the back office side of things, so that you can really focus on running your business, and they'll actually help you run your value chain. Actually, that's important. Next, you want to source vintage clothes to sell. So after funding your business idea, you want to source the vintage clothes to sell. So you can have vintage thrifting. You can also have other sources for funding vintage clothing, like auctions, estate sales, online marketplaces, and classifieds, like sites like Craigslist might turn up some treasures, as well as listings for garage sales, moving sales, or estate sales. You can have pickers. Once you have built your business, consider outsourcing by hiring a picker. This could be a person who simply makes the rounds to thrift shops on a regular basis. Think about wholesalers. Okay, sign up as a trade customer with wholesalers to gain access to a vintage in bulk at a wholesale pricing. That's what you want too. You want to really be able to focus on revenue as well. Think about consignment programs, flea markets, collectors. And so the thing is, if you want to work with wholesalers, you got to really start early, and you got to also have a vision. You got to communicate your vision to them. Very important. Next, you want to manage vintage clothing inventory. So if you want to sell vintage clothing online, you need to really think about managing vintage clothing inventory. Now, what about inventory here? Now, the thing is, without a plan, vintage inventory can start to feel like a disorganized thrift store. So unlike stores with limited product listing and multiple units within each, vintage clothes are usually one of a kind. So once you start selling vintage clothes, a messy system can be detrimental to efficiency. So you got to stay a little organized here. So it's all about organization. It's all about efficiency. It's all about scalability. So what you want to do is you want to develop a system to help store, and identify items to simplify shipping and fulfillment. That's what I was telling you a little earlier when I spoke about the 2PL, 3PL. I spoke about all those logistical operations, all that logistical foundation you got to have in the first place. So processing incoming vintage clothing in batches, it can really help you too, because you are able to organize everything in a clear manner. So let me give you a few vintage inventory tips here. Consider air quality. Use garment bags. Use padded hangers only. Avoid sun. Okay, keep vintage clothes out of natural light. Sun can fade colors. Use the right storage, protect clothing, and also stay organized. Very important. And you also got to think about cleaning and repairing vintage clothing. If you have a piece that's really rare and you want to really save it, then you might really think about clean and repair as well. So when you think about cleaning and repairing vintage clothing, let me give you a few sort of tips here. You want to check the label and follow care instructions. Use a steamer, hand wash, find a reliable dry cleaner. You just never know. And also find a reputable tailor. I mean, if you need to really repair a certain piece and the piece is it's kind of rare, you want to really find a reputable tailor. You want to separate your colors, okay? And also sometimes you might want to consider upcycling. So this is a great way to use pieces of vintage clothing that are too damaged or soiled to sell as is, so upcycling. So if you are trying to sell vintage clothing online right now, I want you to photograph your vintage products. It's all about really product quality. It's all about photo quality too. Now, product photography rather, in the vintage business is an ongoing task. So unlike other clothing stores that may schedule shoots once per season, or let's say, or as new collections are released, vintage merchants have a steady intake of inventory, all of which needs to be individually shot. Because remember, when I'm telling you about vintage clothing, I'm speaking about a rare piece. I'm speaking about a unique piece. I'm speaking about a piece that you may not see 100 years from now. Okay, so it's important to really think about actually photographing the clothes. So you can think about building an in-house photo studio, for instance. If you have the resources, if you have the skills, if you have the vision, why not? You can also think about shooting in tiny pieces. I mean, not tiny pieces, tiny spaces, because to see the whole thing is that I told you a little earlier that color can actually light can discolor the piece. So having a tiny place can be really good. So if you're planning to sell vintage clothing from home or in a small space like an apartment, a permanent studio setup may be unrealistic. In this case, be sure to keep your equipment stored in one place for easy setup and tear down. And take note of tripod placement, camera settings, and lighting conditions so you can recreate the look each time you look. Every time you shoot, but every time you look also. And shoot in batches, say weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, so instead of doing it item by item, just shoot in batches. Also, you can try to outsource photography. I mean, if you have the resources or you find somebody who is really good, why not? Now, let me give you a few DIY vintage clothing photography guidelines. You want to replicate the in-store experience? Capture every angle, shoot a variety of images, supply also inspo. So you want to really inject fun and inspiration into basic product shoots. Shoot in batches, I've said this before. Work with the resources you have. Forget about expensive equipment and don't skip on lighting. Lighting is really, really key. So if you are thinking about selling vintage clothing this year, I want you to develop a pricing strategy. So when you sell vintage clothes, follow the same basic rules for pricing products for e-commerce. What I'm trying to say is be sure to factor in the cost of the item and other overhead expenses, but also remember, you got to think about the constant battle between supply and demand, right? Because if you price too high, people are going to be chased away. But if you price too low, you might actually lose money. So it's important to really think about that because every piece will need to be considered independently. But you may want to stick within a specific range depending on your ideal customer, because everything revolves around your niche, revolves around your customers, your potential customers. So in terms of pricing here, before you actually affix a certain price on an item, you want to consider the rarity, the age, the wearability, the demand, the condition, the trend. So if the style of the garment is currently in fashion, this can be an important element to think about. Also, the label. Is it a luxury brand or fast fashion? So the best way to actually determine selling price is to search for similar vintage items on vintage marketplaces like eBay or Etsy. Are there a ton of the same? Your selling price decreases. Is your item in better condition than others like it? Then your selling price increases. So you have this direct correlation here. Next, you want to set up your online store, right? When I speak about setting up your online store, don't try to reinvent the wheel. You have a lot of players out there that will help you, from Shopify to Big Cartel to Magento to WooCommerce to BigCommerce, who can really help you get things set up real fast. Okay, so you want to pay attention to things like store design. You want to think about critical e-commerce pages. So things like your about page, your brand story, your vision, your contact page, your FAQ page. Those are important. Okay, FAQ stands for frequently asked questions. Also, you want to think about when you think about product pages. Let me give you a few tips for vintage clothing sellers. If the label is missing, search for similar items online to learn more information about the garment. Develop a consistent system for sizing. Include waist, hip, sleeve, and chest measurements in both inches and centimeters. Define a list of terms to describe the condition of vintage items and use terminology consistently throughout the site. If known, add fabric composition and care instructions to the description and tell a story. It's all about storytelling, okay? If the item has a known history, share it on the product page. Your customers will love it. If you want to sell vintage clothing online this year, sell vintage clothing on other channels, okay? The whole thing is that, of course, I'm telling you to sell actually online, but you can also sell offline. Why not? And the thing is, when I'm telling you to sell online, you don't have to only sell on your store. Like, you don't have to have you don't have to show the items on your Shopify store. No, you can sell on social media. You can sell on your website. Yeah, you can have a blog, or you can actually have a plugin that allows you to sell right from your website, right from a landing page. You can sell through email newsletters. So you got to really think about a multiplicity of sales channels. Very important. You have to really think about several avenues for revenue. Okay, so online marketplaces are great. Etsy, eBay, Amazon. You can have e-commerce platforms, Shopify, BigCommerce, WooCommerce, Magento, BigCartel. Okay, and you can also think about selling locally and in person. I mean, it's one of those things where, depending upon the niche you're in, and depending upon your target audience, maybe you could just find better opportunities selling actually in person. The last thing you want to do is you want to market your vintage clothing business. There are several ways to get the word out and attract customers to your store. Some paid, some organic, and you have to do this. You have to do a combo. You know, a good hybrid structure will help you out. So you can have social media marketing for a vintage business. You can do email marketing. You can do organic search and content marketing. So this happens through your blog. You can have a blog where you are basically driving traffic organically to your blog. And you can have loyalty and repeat customers. They are going to be very powerful in getting the word out, and so people know more about you. Next, you want to set up a shipping and returns strategy. Okay, when you think about actually selling online this year, vintage, it's important to have a shipping strategy, because it means that you are deciding where you will ship, the carriers you will work with, like UPS, USPS, GHL, maybe FedEx, depending upon the geography you want to cover. Also think about the rates and option you'll offer to customers and how you will handle returns for your vintage clothing business. Okay, so sustainability is something more and more customers are considering as the shop. So if you are attracting customers based on the sustainable nature of vintage, you can take it a step further by using sustainable packaging for your shipping. You can also think about if you want to sell internationally, what are the conditions you need to really think about, right? Because when you have to sell internationally, in some cases, you might have to pay customs fees. You might have to really think about customs compliance. So those are things you have to think about, not only in the short run, but also in the long run. So here's a closure here to this conversation. I spoke to you about how to sell vintage clothing online. I gave you the opportunity, and after that, the step-by-step. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.